Three true scary hiking horror stories. Terrifying real encounters in the wilderness. Story 1. The Ravine. Into the wilderness. I've been hiking solo for about 7 years now. I'm experienced enough in the backcountry that I don't need marked trails anymore, which is probably what landed me in this nightmare. This happened last November in the Daintree rainforest in far north Queensland, Australia. I'd flown up from Melbourne for a long weekend, planning to explore some of the more isolated sections that tourists never see. The weather forecast looked perfect. Low 20 Celsius, partly cloudy, light humidity. I was looking forward to genuine isolation. I was roughly 5 hours into the trek when I reached what I can only describe as a ravine. It wasn't some massive chasm, but it was deep, maybe 12 to 15 meters down to jagged rocks below with a thin stream weaving through them. Not certain death if you fell, but you definitely shatter bones. The walls were slick with moss and overhanging vegetation, making them impossible to climb without proper gear. There was this enormous fallen eucalyptus wedged between both sides of the steep angle. The trunk was thick, probably a meter in diameter. The bark was worn smooth from weather and likely other hikers who'd used it as a crossing point. I examined it for several minutes, testing its stability with my weight. It seemed solid enough, so I decided to cross. I took my time, moving carefully across the angled trunk, trying not to look down at the rocks below. My heart pounded as I focused on each step. When I finally reached the other side and stepped onto solid ground, I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. The adrenaline rush from the crossing was exhilarating. Then I heard it, a rhythmic asterisk thwack, thwack, thwack asterisk behind me. I spun around. There was a man on the opposite side of the ravine, maybe 3 meters from where the tree met the bank. He was older, definitely in his 60s, wearing a filthy high-vis vest over a stained singlet and torn work pants. He had this scraggly gray beard streaked with what looked like mud or dried blood. It took me a second to process what he was holding, a hatchet, a full-size bushman's hatchet with a rusted head. He walked directly to the base of the tree and started swinging at it. I shouted across at him, "Oi, what the hell are you doing?" He didn't even glance up. He just kept swinging, and I watched in horror as one of his strikes bit deeper than the others. The tree shifted with a grinding sound. I yelled louder, telling him to stop, that I'd just crossed on that bloody thing. It hit me then. This bloke probably already knew that. He was trying to trap me on this side. He didn't show any signs of stopping, so I started screaming increasingly vulgar things at him. Stuff that would make a sailor blush. Finally, I shouted that I needed to cross back to get to my car. That's when he stopped. He looked up at me slowly, and I could see his face properly for the first time. His eyes were sunken deep into his skull, surrounded by dark, bruised-looking skin. The whites of his eyes had this yellowish tint. He leaned over the edge of the ravine and said in this eerily calm voice, "That's not my problem, mate." The casual tone of it infuriated me. I completely lost it. I started full-on screaming at him, calling him every name I could think of. Something I said must have struck a nerve because he stopped mid-swing. He actually set the hatchet down carefully, then took several steps closer to the edge. He stared directly at me and said something I'll never forget. "I know these woods a lot better than you do. A lot better." The way he emphasized those last 2 words, it wasn't a threat exactly, but a certainty, like he was stating an undeniable fact. We locked eyes for what felt like an eternity. Then he picked up the hatchet, turned around, and disappeared into the dense rainforest. I stood there trying to process what had just happened. The tree was still wedged in place, but the damage was obvious. The edge on his side was splintered and cracked, with fibers hanging loose. I wanted to cross back immediately, but there was no way I was trusting my weight to that tree now. I pulled out my mobile. No signal. Not surprising this deep in the Daintree. I decided to abort the hike. I was angry, but I was also genuinely spooked. Something about that encounter felt profoundly wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. I started walking downstream, figuring I'd find another crossing point that would eventually loop me back toward the trailhead. But I was dead wrong. I walked for what must have been 90 minutes, and the ravine only got deeper and wider. I kept thinking I'd find a spot to cross, but every turn revealed more impossible terrain. The sun was dropping fast now. I was getting desperate. I was kilometers from my car, heading in the opposite direction, and darkness was coming. I seriously started considering whether I'd have to climb down into the ravine and back out, as insane as that seemed. That's when I stumbled into what looked like a campsite. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by massive fig trees. There was a fire pit that looked recently used. I could still smell ash in the air. At first, I felt a wave of relief. Maybe there were other campers who could help me. But the more I looked around, the more wrong everything felt. There were carvings on the surrounding trees. Not initials or trail markers. These were intentional, deep gouges forming symbols I didn't recognize. Some looked almost like Aboriginal artwork, but twisted and wrong. Around the clearing, things were hanging from branches on what looked like leather cords, animal skulls, possums, maybe wallabies, rusted tools, pieces of clothing tied in knots, and what appeared to be lengths of hair woven together. The fire pit wasn't just a ring of stones. The stones were carefully stacked into small tower-like structures, and inside the pit were burnt items, melted plastic bottles, scorched photographs of the faces burned away, and what looked disturbingly like teeth. As soon as I registered what I was seeing, I backed away from the clearing. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear blood rushing in my ears. I was easily twice as frightened as I'd been minutes ago. Then I started hearing sounds behind me. Footsteps, or something like footsteps, the crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs. Every time I spun around, everything went silent. I started thinking some predator was tracking me, maybe a wild pig or even a dingo, though they're rare this far north. I picked up my pace, practically jogging now. But if anything, the sounds only got louder and closer. What happened next is burned into my memory forever. As I heard the next sound, I looked back over my shoulder and caught a clear glimpse of someone ducking behind a tree. A person, not an animal. I froze and scanned the rainforest. There wasn't just one. There was another figure further to the left, partially obscured by a massive tree fern. They'd fanned out. They were herding me. I don't know what made me realize they'd given up on stealth, but suddenly I could hear them moving openly through the undergrowth. I saw what looked like a metal pipe or club in one person's hand. That was it. I just started running. They immediately started chasing me, no longer concerned with being quiet. I can't explain the primal terror that gripped me. I didn't know what they wanted. I was lost in the middle of a rainforest. The sun was setting, and I felt like I was in a genuine life or death situation. That's probably how I was able to run so fast for so long. I ran faster than I knew I could, faster than I'd ever run in my life. One of the people behind me started making this sound. Not words, just this high-pitched shrieking, like some kind of war cry. Absolutely nightmarish. The ravine was still on my left. Just when I felt my legs about to give out from exhaustion, I saw another fallen tree. It was much smaller than the first one, thinner and at an even steeper angle, but I had no choice. Without thinking, I stepped onto it and started across. I didn't have time to test it for stability. I was literally betting my life on this tree. My muscles were screaming, my vision was blurring from exhaustion, and I was so certain I was going to slip and fall to my death. But it held. I made it across. As soon as my feet touched solid ground, I turned around, gasping for air. There were 4 figures following me, 4 carbon copies of that first man. They were all filthy, all wearing torn clothing, all holding makeshift weapons. One definitely had a pipe. Another was carrying what looked like a rock tied to a branch. I watched as the first one put his hand on the tree like he was going to cross. Then he stopped. He stepped back. All 4 of them stared at me with this hollow, predatory look. I found myself unable to move, locked in place by their gazes. Then one of them, the one with the pipe, smiled. Not a friendly smile. A smile like a predator deciding to let its prey go. He said, "Get the fuck out of here, city boy. You got lucky. Real lucky." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran. I kept expecting to hear them behind me, but the forest had gone eerily quiet. The darkness didn't help, and there were multiple moments when I had to fight back full panic attacks. I must have run at an angle that eventually brought me back toward a trail, because I did eventually find marked path. From there, I managed to orient myself and make it back to the trailhead. It was completely dark by then, nearly 9 p.m. I drove straight back to my accommodation and reported what I could to the local police the next day, but I could tell from their expressions they thought I'd either hallucinated or exaggerated. One officer asked if I'd been using any substances. They took a report but said without being able to locate the exact area, there wasn't much they could do. It's been months now. I still hike, but I haven't been able to enjoy it the way I used to. I really hope that changes because hiking was my absolute favorite thing to do, and now I can't do it without thinking about that day. That first man with the hatchet especially. The way he looked at me when he said he knew those woods better than me. He probably did. Hell, he probably orchestrated the whole thing. Stranded me on that side knowing his friends were waiting. It terrifies me to think how close I came to dying that day. Sometimes I wonder if they're still out there, waiting for the next solo hiker who thinks they experience enough to wander off the marked trails. Story 2. The Smoke. Lost. This happened 4 years ago. I'm not going to drag things out, so I'll just say exactly what happened as it happened. I was hiking through a remote section of forest in northern British Columbia, Canada, way off any marked trails. I've always preferred it that way. The actual wilderness, not the sanitized version you get on popular trails with their signs and maintained paths. Just me in the forest, the way it's supposed to be. I'd been out there for maybe 5 hours when I noticed I completely lost my bearings. It happens sometimes when you're not following a trail, but usually I can orient myself quickly using the sun and landmarks. This time was different. Nothing looked familiar, and the dense conifer canopy was making it difficult to track the sun's position. It was still light enough that I wasn't in immediate danger, but that sick feeling of being lost was already settling into my stomach like a stone. I tried to stay calm and kept walking, telling myself I'd spot something recognizable soon. Instead, I started picking up on this rustling sound behind me, the last thing you want to hear when you're lost. The rustling wasn't constant, just every 30 seconds or so, like something was pacing me. I'd stop and it would stop. I'd start walking, and there it was again. I kept telling myself it was probably a deer, but I'd hiked enough to know that deer don't follow people like that. They run away. I kept going, but by that point I was pretty certain I was being stalked by something. Then all at once, the rustling turned into movement all around me. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. I was surrounded on all sides by a pack of wolves. 7 or 8 of them, if I had to count. Some were snarling, lips pulled back over yellowed fangs. Others just stared with those predatory yellow eyes. It was clear to me that to them, I was food. I had my knife out even though I knew the odds were stacked impossibly against me. I remember thinking with absolute clarity, this is it. This is actually how I'm going to die. Alone in the woods because I was too arrogant to stick to the marked trails. I was trying to decide whether to make myself big or stay still when every single wolf suddenly went rigid. Not like they were reacting to each other. All of them reacted to something at the exact same instant, like they'd heard a frequency I couldn't perceive. Their ears shot up and they all looked in the same direction, somewhere over my left shoulder. And then they just scattered. Not a slow retreat, a full-on sprint in the opposite direction from whatever they'd sensed. Like they weren't the hunters anymore. Like they were the prey. That's when real fear set in. Until that moment, it had been adrenaline and survival instinct. But once I was alone again, I started getting the creeps in a way I'd never experienced. The first thing I noticed was that the woods were completely silent. No wind, no birds, no insects, nothing. It was like someone had hit a mute button on reality. It was still light out, but things felt dimmer somehow. Like my vision was fading, the way it does right before you pass out from blood loss or heat exhaustion. Everything had this gray, washed-out quality. But the worst part was knowing that the wolves had been scared of something. They'd had me surrounded, ready to take me down, and they'd fled in terror from something they'd sensed at a distance. Whatever could scare off an entire wolf pack from far away. I couldn't even imagine what that might be. I needed to keep moving, but I felt profoundly unsettled, even in the remaining daylight. Part of me wanted to follow the wolves, but I was pretty certain I'd been walking in the right direction before. So I was at a crossroads, follow the wolves and potentially get even more lost, or continue in my original direction toward whatever had terrified them. I decided to keep walking in the direction I thought would take me out, which meant walking toward whatever the wolves had fled from. My logic was I could waste an hour walking the wrong way only to have to backtrack in the dark, or I could push forward while I still had daylight. Maybe 25 minutes later, I saw what looked like a clearing up ahead. For a second, I thought it might be a campsite. I could see what looked like a fire ring, but as I got closer, I realized everything was wrong. There were symbols carved into the trees surrounding the clearing. Not initials or trail markers. These were intentional, deep cuts forming patterns that hurt my eyes to look at. They seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. Things were hanging from the branches on what looked like leather cords. Some looked like bones, small ones, maybe from birds or squirrels. Others were metal objects, rusted and twisted into shapes that made no geometric sense. The fire pit in the center wasn't just a ring of stones. The stones were meticulously stacked on top of one another into small can-like structures, each one perfectly balanced. Inside the fire pit were strange objects, pieces of cloth, what looked like jewelry, animal teeth arranged in spiral patterns, and other things I couldn't identify. But here's what made me truly freeze up. The smoke. There was this thick black smoke just hanging in the air about 2 meters off the ground. It wasn't moving. It wasn't dissipating. It wasn't drifting with any wind. It just hung there in a column, perfectly still, like it was frozen in time. And it wasn't coming from the fire pit. The fire pit looked like it hadn't been used in weeks. There weren't even any ashes, just those arranged objects sitting on bare earth. The smoke was just asterisk there asterisk, suspended in midair, defying physics. I stood at the edge of that clearing, frozen. For some reason, I couldn't look away from that smoke. My eyes kept tracking back to it even when I tried focusing on something else. It had this hypnotic quality, like staring into deep water. I really struggled to describe the feeling, but it felt like I was looking through a window at something instead of actually being there. Like I was standing at my apartment window looking out at the street instead of actually being on the street. It felt like there was a barrier between me and reality, like I was observing from outside of existence itself. There was this feeling building in my chest, grief and terror mixed together, but for something that hadn't happened yet. It was almost like my body was mourning something in advance, grieving for a future that hadn't arrived. I've never felt anything like it before or since. The closest I can come is that feeling you get right before you receive terrible news, when you somehow know something awful has happened, but you don't know what yet. I must have stood there for 10 minutes just staring at that smoke. And no, the smoke didn't move or dissipate in that time. It just stayed there, hanging impossibly in the air. Something in my brain finally kicked back online, some survival instinct that overrode the hypnotic pull of that smoke. I turned around and ran. I didn't walk or jog. I literally ran at full sprint through the forest, branches whipping my face, roots trying to trip me. I was overwhelmed with a fear I can't put into words. I didn't know what I was running from, but there was this feeling in my gut that told me I needed to get out of those woods immediately or something terrible would happen. Not just that I might die, something worse than death. My memory gets foggy after that. I think it's because of how terrified I was, so scared that my higher brain function shut down and pure instinct took over. But part of me thinks the reason my memory faded was somehow connected to whatever was in those woods. The smoke or the thing that made the smoke or something else entirely. The next thing I clearly remember is it being completely dark. I must have been running through those woods for another hour or more. I was drenched in sweat and strangely freezing cold, shivering violently despite the exertion. But I was nearly out. I was approaching the trailhead where I'd parked. I could see my truck in the moonlight. I got in, locked the doors, and drove off without another thought. I drove for 3 hours straight before I felt safe enough to stop for gas. I never reported what I found. What would I even say? I couldn't find that clearing again if I tried. I have no idea where it was. And that's even assuming I remembered things clearly, which I don't. There's this whole gap in my memory, maybe 45 minutes to an hour, that's just completely blank. This will forever be one of those experiences that just doesn't have an explanation. When I told my older brother about what happened, he said that everyone who spends enough time in the wilderness has that one experience eventually. Well, this is mine. The thing I still think about isn't how those wolves behaved, how that campsite looked, or even that impossible smoke. It's the memory loss. From everything I've read, traumatic moments get remembered better, not worse. They get burned into your brain with perfect clarity. So I have no choice but to think that something happened during that lost hour. Something my brain either couldn't process or chose to forget. And sometimes, late at night, I'm grateful I don't remember. Because if the smoke I *do* remember was that terrifying, What the hell happened during the hour I don't? Story 3. The Stalkers. The trip. Back when I was younger, my mates and I loved to go camping. Once we got our licenses at 17, we were out almost every weekend exploring new spots in the bush. Our parents didn't really care as long as we were responsible and could look after ourselves. For this reason, my dad let us borrow one of his rifles, a .22 for snakes and the like. This happened when we were 19, just finished with our first year of uni. In March, me and my girlfriend Sophie, my mate Liam, and his boyfriend Marcus were going to drive up to the Blue Mountains in New South Wales and do some backcountry camping away from the tourist spots. It was an 8-hour drive from Melbourne where we lived, so we left early and made it there around 6 p.m. We set up camp at an established campground for the night since it was late and we were knackered. Sophie and I were sharing a tent, and Liam and Marcus were in another. I had the rifle in my tent. Nothing happened that first night. The next morning, we woke up, made breakfast, and drove to the start of a trail. We were planning to hike to a lookout point over the valley, then find a spot to set up a proper bush camp for a couple nights. On the hike to the lookout, Marcus kept saying he felt like someone was watching him. Then he said he'd seen someone standing completely still between the trees, just staring at him. We stopped to look, and we all saw a woman quickly dart behind a massive eucalyptus tree. Liam yelled at her to piss off or we'll knock your head in, mostly posturing to impress Marcus, but we were capable of handling ourselves if needed. We continued the hike and didn't see her again. We eventually made it to the lookout, absolutely stunning views of the Jameson Valley, and there we had lunch and took photos. After about 90 minutes, we decided to go find a place to set up camp before it got dark. While we were looking for a campsite, I noticed this freakishly tall man standing between the trees about 50 meters away, completely motionless, just staring at us. He had to be at least 2 meters tall, maybe taller. Gaunt, almost skeletal. It genuinely freaked me out. I pointed him out and everyone else got unsettled too. We yelled at him to leave us alone and told him we had a gun. He didn't move for a long moment, just kept staring. Then he turned very slowly and walked away into the bush, moving with his strange, stiff gait. We decided to hike further since we were all properly creeped out. We had no idea if the two weirdos were connected somehow, but we weren't taking chances. After another hour, we found a good spot next to a small creek with a relatively deep swimming hole. We decided to get in the water and relax, try to shake off the unease. While we were swimming around, we joked about the earlier incidents, convinced they were probably just local bludgers on drugs or something. When the sun started to set, we got out and made dinner. We had brought lamb chops to grill, damper to bake in the coals, and vegetables to roast. We always ate well on our camping trips. While I was cooking, Liam set up his tent and helped me with mine. I finished cooking and we ate before cracking open some of the beer we brought. I wasn't still a regular smoker, so I brought some cannabis to roll up. We wanted to have a good time since we'd put a lot of money into this trip. We told stories and laughed well into the night. It got to a point where Marcus fell out of his chair from laughing and just laid on the ground in hysterics. We did this late into the night before eventually stumbling to our tents. Sophie and I were messing around in our tent when we suddenly heard someone laughing outside. Not friendly laughter, this high-pitched, manic cackling that made my blood run cold. At first, I thought maybe it was Liam pissing about for some reason, so I called out, "Very funny, mate." Liam yelled back from his tent, "That wasn't me. What the fuck was that?" My heart sank. I was immediately sober. I grabbed a rifle, burst out of the tent, and fired 2 shots into the air, screaming for whoever it was to fuck off or I'd shoot them properly. That seemed to work because I heard footsteps, multiple sets of footsteps, running away through the bush. We moved our tents closer together and decided to take turns staying awake as lookout. I took first watch, rifle across my lap, jumping at every sound. The next day, we debated going home early, but ultimately decided against it. We were convinced we'd scared them off with a rifle. We planned to hike somewhere closer to the main trails and camp for one final night before heading home. After breakfast, we packed up and started hiking back toward the more popular areas. During the hike, we ran into another group of backpackers and told them what had happened. They were freaked out too and said they'd seen some dodgy-looking characters near the car park the day before, a really tall bloke and a woman who'd been hanging around the cars. We chatted for a bit, then continued on. When we stopped for lunch, I realized those were the only other people we'd seen so far, despite there being heaps of cars at the trailhead when we'd arrived. After lunch, we continued down the trail. After about 10 kilometers, we decided to set up camp. We were roughly 5 kilometers from the nearest exit. We pitched our tents and cooked sausages and vegetables for dinner. We ate, drank, and smoked again before heading to the tent, trying to recapture the fun of the night before. But there was this underlying tension none of us could shake. In the middle of the night, I woke up needing to piss, so I crawled out of the tent. Out of paranoia, I made sure to bring the rifle. While I was relieving myself, I heard Lee's crunching nearby, deliberate, heavy footsteps. My heart stopped. I grabbed the rifle, finished up quickly, pulled up my pants, and switched on my torch. The beam revealed a tall man from before standing maybe 15 meters away, holding a machete. A proper bushman's machete, the blade glinting in my torchlight. I could see him clearly now. Long, matted hair, face covered in what looked like ritual scars or self-inflicted cuts. His eyes reflected the light like an animal's. He was wearing filthy clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in months. I screamed and raised a rifle as he started charging at me with the machete raised. I fired every shot I had, 4 rounds in quick succession. I must have hit him at least once because I heard him yell and saw him stumble and fall. By now, Liam, Sophie, and Marcus were all awake and screaming. I yelled at them to grab their packs. We needed to leave immediately. We didn't have time for the tents or most of our gear. I didn't want to involve the police because I wasn't sure about the legality of what I'd just done. And honestly, his life didn't seem worth destroying my future over. We grabbed our packs and basically ran the final 5 kilometers, making it back to the car park in just over 40 minutes of near-constant running. We piled into the car, locked the doors, and I wanted to drive immediately, but everyone else convinced me we were too shaken up and exhausted. We covered the windows with blankets and tried to sleep in the car, jumping at every sound outside. When we woke up in the morning, none of us had really slept, just dozed fitfully. We noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were handprints on the outside of the car windows. Multiple handprints. Dirty, smeared handprints where someone had been pressing their hands against the glass, peering in at us while we tried to sleep. We didn't say a word. I just started the engine and we drove straight out of there, not stopping until we reached the McDonald's about an hour away. We sat there in the parking lot, nobody saying anything, just processing what had happened. We never called the police. I'm still conflicted about whether we should have. This happened years ago and no reports about it ever came out in the news. I've searched online multiple times over the years, looking for any mention of bodies found or arrests made in the Blue Mountains. Nothing. Epilogue. So for all I know, those psychopaths are still out there. Maybe that tall man survived. Maybe I missed entirely and just scared him off. Maybe they are still hunting hikers who wander too far from the main trails. I still have nightmares about those handprints on the windows, about how they must have been standing there in the darkness, watching us sleep, deciding what to do with us. If I hadn't had that rifle, if I hadn't woken up when I did, if I had been a worse shot, any number of things could have gone differently. We could have just disappeared. 4 uni students who went camping and never came back. Another unsolved mystery in the Blue Mountains, added to all the other disappearances over the years. I barely hike in them all. When I do, it's only on popular trails, always with other people, and I'm constantly looking over my shoulder. Sophie and I broke up about a year after that trip. Not directly because of what happened, but it definitely put a strain on things. Liam and Marcus are still together, but they don't camp anymore either. Sometimes I wonder if we were specifically targeted, if they'd been watching us from the moment we arrived, or if we were just unlucky, wrong place at the wrong time. I don't know which possibility is more terrifying. What I do know is this: the wilderness isn't always peaceful. Sometimes there are things out there, people out there, that are far more dangerous than any animal, and they know those woods a hell of a lot better than you do. These stories are based on real experiences, though some details have been altered to protect the identities of those involved. If you're planning on hiking in remote areas, please take proper precautions. Let someone know where you're going. Carry communication devices. Never hike alone in truly isolated areas. And trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is.